In the glittering streets of Los Angeles, a city of dreams and broken promises, Enrique Foster once stood as a Hollywood icon. But fame is fleeting, and now he finds himself wandering through the cold, his fortune lost and his name forgotten. On the verge of despair, he crosses paths with a mysterious young girl selling fragile paper stars on a desolate street corner. Her handmade creations, adorned with glitter and hope, spark something in Enrique's soul, a glimmer of light in the shadow of his failures. As their worlds collide in the glow of the city's holiday cheer, Enrique embarks on an unexpected journey of redemption. But what power lies in the hands of a child? And can a single golden star guide a fallen man back to himself? This is a story of second chances, where the spirit of Christmas isn't found in riches but in the quiet resilience of the human heart. The city of Los Angeles, with its endless lights and towering billboards, pulsed with life as the evening set in. Yet for Enrique Foster, none of that brilliance could pierce the suffocating darkness enveloping him. Once a shining star of Hollywood's child actor scene, Enrique now stood on the crumbling edge of obscurity. His agent, the one person he had trusted to handle his precarious finances, had disappeared overnight, taking with him the last remnants of Enrique's fortune. To make matters worse, he left behind mountains of unpaid gambling debts in Enrique's name. That morning, Enrique had been forced out of his penthouse in Beverly Hills. The building manager, once deferential, had spoken to him with a cold, almost triumphant tone. There had been no time to gather his belongings beyond a small suitcase and a duffel bag filled with clothes. The rest, expensive suits, memorabilia from his acting days, even his collection of custom watches, was locked inside the apartment he no longer owned. Now he trudged down a cracked sidewalk, pulling his suitcase behind him. The wheels wobbled over the uneven pavement, a faint reminder of how everything in his life seemed out of sync. Around him, the city glowed with holiday cheer. Strings of lights wrapped around palm trees, storefronts displayed lavish decorations, and cheerful voices filled the air. Enrique barely noticed. He tightened his coat against the cold, though it offered little comfort. By nightfall, he found himself outside a rundown motel on the fringes of the city. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its letters blinking sporadically. Vacancy, it declared, though the place hardly looked welcoming. Enrique pushed open the glass door of the lobby, the bell above it jingling weakly. The receptionist, an older man with a face carved by years of indifference, barely glanced up as Enrique approached the desk. "How much for the night?" Enrique asked, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. $40, the man replied, chewing gum lazily. Enrique fumbled through his wallet, pulling out the last of his cash. He handed over 2 crumpled 20s, wincing at the thought of how far he'd fallen. The receptionist slid a key across the counter without another word, pointing toward a dimly lit corridor. The room smelled faintly of mildew and stale air. The bedspread was worn, the pattern faded from countless washes, and a single bare bulb illuminated the space. Enrique dropped his suitcase near the door and collapsed onto the bed. For a moment, he stared at the cracked ceiling, his mind spinning. How had it come to this? Memories surfaced, unbidden and painful. He thought of the nights when his face lit up screens across the country, when his name was synonymous with success. Back then, everyone wanted a piece of him, directors, fans, sponsors. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The cold from outside seemed to seep through the walls, mingling with the chill in his chest. His thoughts spiraled, jumping from anger at his agent's betrayal to shame over his own recklessness. How had he not seen this coming? He had trusted too easily, spent too freely, and now there was nothing left. A faint sound from outside caught his attention. He rose from the bed and moved to the window. Pulling back the thin curtain, he saw a family loading bags into the trunk of an old car. The father, bundled in a worn coat, laughed as his children played in the parking lot, their laughter echoing faintly in the night. Enrique watched them for a moment, feeling an ache he couldn't quite name. He turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, heavier than he thought he could bear. But even in that moment of despair, a flicker of something stirred within him, a faint, almost imperceptible spark that refused to die completely. The heater in the corner sputtered to life, emitting a low hum as it struggled to warm the room. Enrique lay back on the bed, pulling the threadbare blanket over himself. He knew tomorrow would bring more challenges, but for now, all he could do was endure the night. As sleep finally claimed him, the city outside continued to sparkle. Its lights shone brightly, indifferent to his suffering, a reminder of a world that kept moving forward even when he felt stuck. Somewhere in that endless sea of light, there had to be a path back to the person he once was, or perhaps, to someone entirely new. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of Enrique's motel room, casting dull streaks on the stained walls. He blinked awake, disoriented for a moment by his unfamiliar surroundings. The faint hum of the old heater had stopped during the night, leaving the room icy and unwelcoming. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, feeling the stiffness in his neck and shoulders from the lumpy mattress. The silence of the room was unbearable, so he dressed quickly, putting on the same clothes he had worn the day before. A once expensive coat now looked worn and faded, the edges frayed from years of neglect. Pulling it tight around himself, Enrique grabbed his wallet and stepped out into the brisk December air. The streets of Los Angeles, normally alive with honking horns and the chatter of pedestrians, were subdued in the early hours. But even in this quiet, the city carried its relentless energy. Enrique's stomach growled, and he walked aimlessly, searching for something cheap enough to eat. He passed a food truck, the aroma of breakfast burritos wafting toward him. His mouth watered, but a glance at the few remaining bills in his wallet made him keep walking. As the sun climbed higher, the streets began to fill. Families, tourists, and shoppers filled Hollywood Boulevard, their laughter and conversation rising above the hum of traffic. Enrique drifted among them, feeling like a ghost. The familiar landmarks, Grauman's Chinese Theater, the Walk of Fame, the towering billboards, seemed almost mocking now. These were the places he had once visited as a celebrated actor, his name spoken with admiration. Now, he moved unnoticed, another face in the crowd. He stopped in front of a souvenir shop, gazing at the rows of Hollywood memorabilia displayed in the window. Plastic Oscars, mugs, and T-shirts emblazoned with "I Red Heart LA" stared back at him. For a brief moment, he thought about going inside. Maybe seeing his old movies on the shelves would remind him of better times. But the idea of finding his name reduced to a dusty DVD in the bargain bin was too much to bear. As he turned away, he caught sight of a young couple posing for a photo on the Walk of Fame. The man pointed down at a star, and the woman laughed, holding onto his arm. Enrique squinted, recognizing the name beneath their feet. It was a star belonging to an actor who had been a peer, someone who had climbed to stardom alongside him. The sight triggered a flood of memories, red carpets, press junkets, nights spent basking in the glow of fame, but those days felt distant, like they had happened to someone else entirely. Enrique shoved his hands into his pockets and kept walking, his eyes fixed on the pavement to avoid the faces of happy strangers. As the day stretched on, the ache in his stomach became unbearable. He found a corner store and bought a cheap sandwich and a bottle of water, consuming them on a bench outside. The food did little to lift his spirits. Around him, the city seemed to sparkle with holiday cheer. Children laughed as they pointed at window displays filled with twinkling lights and animatronic Santas. Street performers dressed as elves juggled candy canes, drawing cheers from passing crowds. Enrique felt a pang of bitterness rise in his chest. How could the world go on celebrating when his life had fallen apart? He had given so much to this city, to this industry, and yet here he was, alone, broke, forgotten. He stood up abruptly, tossing the sandwich wrapper into a nearby trash can. The sun was beginning to set, and the lights of Hollywood Boulevard were growing brighter. Neon signs flickered to life, casting colorful reflections on the pavement. Enrique wandered aimlessly, his thoughts racing. He found himself in front of a small park tucked away between the towering buildings. A Christmas tree stood at its center, adorned with ornaments and lights. Beneath it, a group of volunteers handed out food and blankets to people in need. Enrique hesitated, watching from a distance. The line of people waiting for help stretched down the block, their faces weary but hopeful. The sight filled him with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to join them, to admit that he, too, needed help. But his pride held him back. He turned away and continued walking, the weight of his shame pressing heavily on his chest. Night had fully descended by the time Enrique returned to Hollywood Boulevard. The streets were alive with music and laughter, the festive atmosphere almost overwhelming. He paused outside a theater, its marquee glowing brightly with the name of a holiday musical. A line of people wrapped around the building, their faces lit with excitement. Enrique's gaze lingered on the posters displayed outside. The smiling faces of the cast stared back at him, their names printed in bold letters. He felt a stab of longing. Performing had once been his greatest joy, a way to connect with people and tell stories. But now, even the thought of stepping on stage filled him with doubt. As he turned to leave, he caught his reflection in a shop window. The man staring back at him looked older than his years, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Enrique frowned, stepping closer to examine his reflection. For the first time in years, he saw himself not as the star he had once been, but as the man he had become, a man lost in his own failures. The realization hit him like a blow, and he staggered back, clutching his coat. He turned away from the window and walked quickly down the street, his heart pounding. The city's lights blurred around him, their brilliance only deepening the emptiness he felt inside. By the time Enrique reached the motel, his legs ached, and his body felt heavy with fatigue. He unlocked the door to his room and stepped inside, the familiar smell of mildew greeting him. He dropped his coat on the chair and sank onto the bed, staring blankly at the floor. The sounds of the city outside filtered through the thin walls, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional burst of laughter, the faint notes of a street performer's saxophone. Enrique lay back, his mind churning. He had spent the day surrounded by the energy and vibrance of Los Angeles, yet he had never felt more alone. As the hours ticked by, sleep eluded him. He lay in the darkness, the glow of the city lights seeping through the curtains. For all its sparkle and glamour, the city seemed to offer no solace, only reminders of what he had lost. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this wasn't the end. But for now, that voice was drowned out by the deafening silence of his despair. Enrique Foster wandered aimlessly through the streets as the evening deepened, his steps slower, his shoulders heavier than they had been that morning. The lights of Los Angeles were in full bloom now, casting golden hues on the faces of passers-by, but for Enrique, they felt distant, like stars he could see but never touch. Each step took him farther from the glimmering heart of Hollywood Boulevard, and the sidewalks grew quieter, lined with fewer storefronts and more shadows. His breath formed pale clouds in the crisp December air as he shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets. The bitter cold bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His mind churned with the same endless loop of regret and anger, circling back to the question that haunted him most: how had he fallen so far? Turning a corner, Enrique found himself on a less traveled street, where the holiday decorations were sparse, and the glow of the city seemed dimmer. The buildings here were older, their facades chipped and their windows barred. A lone lamppost flickered above a graffiti-covered wall, the faint buzzing of its bulb a counterpoint to the silence. He stopped beneath it, leaning against the pole and rubbing his temples. It was then that he heard the soft jingling of bells. At first, it was so faint that he thought he'd imagined it. But as he stood still, straining to listen, the sound grew louder, accompanied by the shuffling of footsteps. He turned his head, searching for the source, and spotted a small figure a few yards away. The figure moved slowly, almost cautiously, down the sidewalk. As it drew closer, Enrique could make out a young girl, perhaps no older than 10 or 11, carrying a cardboard box in her arms. She wore a threadbare jacket that was far too thin for the weather, and her shoes were scuffed and mismatched. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, framing a pair of large, watchful eyes. "Stars for sale," the girl called softly, her voice barely carrying over the quiet street. "Handmade stars for Christmas. Help a family in need." Enrique blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. He watched as she stopped in front of a closed storefront, setting her box down carefully on the ground. Inside the box were dozens of small, delicate stars, each crafted from colorful paper and decorated with glitter, beads, or tiny ribbons. She picked up one of the stars and held it up, tilting it toward the light. "Would you like to buy a star, sir?" she asked, her voice directed at him now. Enrique hesitated. He had spent much of the day avoiding interactions with strangers, retreating into himself like a turtle withdrawing into its shell. But something about the girl's earnest expression and the faint tremor in her voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "What are they for?" he asked, his voice rasping after hours of silence. "For Christmas," she said simply. "To decorate your tree or your home. They bring good luck." Enrique glanced down at the stars, noticing the care that had gone into each one. Some were folded into perfect three-dimensional shapes, while others were flat and adorned with intricate designs. They were imperfect, but charming in their simplicity. "How much?" he asked, reaching into his pocket without much thought. "Whatever you can spare," the girl said. "I'm trying to save enough to buy dinner for my family tonight." The words hit Enrique harder than he expected. His hand paused inside his pocket, feeling the crumpled bills he had left. He could count them without looking, 2 ones and a 5, barely enough to stretch through another day. For a moment, he considered walking away. He barely had enough for himself, let alone to spare for a stranger. But as he looked into the girl's eyes, he saw something there that he couldn't ignore, a flicker of determination, hope clinging stubbornly in the face of hardship. It was a look he hadn't seen in his own reflection for years. Silently, he pulled out the $5 bill and handed it to her. The girl's face lit up with a small smile as she carefully selected one of the stars from the box. "This one is for you," she said, holding it out to him. Enrique took the star, its fragile edges brushing against his fingers. It was made of golden paper, with tiny specks of glitter that shimmered faintly under the lampost's flickering light. In the center, written in looping cursive with a black marker, was a single sentence: "Never lose hope for a true Christmas." The words sent a shiver through him, though not from the cold. He stared at the star for a long moment before slipping it into the pocket of his coat. "Thank you," he said quietly, unsure if he was speaking to the girl or the universe itself. The girl nodded and returned to her box, arranging the stars carefully as though they were precious treasures. Enrique stood there for a moment longer, watching her. Then, with a nod to himself, he turned and began to walk away. But as he moved down the street, he found that he couldn't stop thinking about the girl and her stars. Her voice, her determination, and the message on the star she had given him lingered in his mind. It was such a small gesture, yet it had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. That he pulled the star from his pocket as he walked, holding it up to catch the glow of a nearby streetlight. The glitter sparkled faintly, and the words seemed to glow with an inner light of their own. For the first time in a long time, Enrique felt a glimmer of something that wasn't anger or despair. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if he even had the strength to face it. But as he held the little star in his hand, he felt the faintest hint of warmth bloom in his chest, and for the first time in months, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth hoping for. The motel room was no warmer than it had been the night before. Enrique sat on the edge of the bed, his coat still on, the small paper star resting in his hands. The golden paper shimmered faintly under the dim light of the room's single bulb. He ran his thumb over the words inscribed on it: "Never lose hope for a true Christmas." The message felt simple yet profound, resonating in a way that unsettled him. He set the star carefully on the nightstand, next to the battered alarm clock and the empty bottle of water. Leaning back against the headboard, Enrique closed his eyes, but sleep remained elusive. His thoughts kept circling back to the young girl on the street corner, the determination in her voice, the quiet dignity with which she had offered her stars. Everything about her stirred something deep inside him. Enrique tried to shake it off, telling himself that she was just another street vendor, another reminder of how far he had fallen. But he couldn't ignore the way her words had pierced through his despair, leaving a faint but undeniable glimmer of light. When morning came, it arrived not with the golden glow of dawn but with a muted grayness that seeped through the thin curtains. The hum of the city was already building outside, but inside the room, everything felt still and heavy. Enrique rose reluctantly, his body stiff and aching from another night on the unforgiving motel bed that he splashed cold water on his face in the tiny bathroom, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man looking back at him was a stranger, his cheeks hollow, his eyes shadowed and dull. His hair, once meticulously styled for red carpets and photo shoots, hung limply around his face that he pulled the star from his pocket and held it up, letting the faint morning light catch its glittering surface. It looked out of place in the grimy motel room, like something from another world. For a brief moment, Enrique allowed himself to wonder what the girl's life was like. Had she managed to sell enough stars to buy her family dinner? Did she have a warm bed to sleep in, or was she out there somewhere, braving the same cold he had endured? Pushing the thought aside, Enrique tucked the star back into his pocket and left the motel. The air outside was crisp and biting, the kind of cold that seeped through layers and settled in your bones. Enrique pulled his coat tighter around him as he made his way toward the city's bustling streets. Hollywood Boulevard was already alive with activity, its sidewalks crowded with tourists and street performers. Enrique moved through the throngs of people like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarkable. He passed the souvenir shops and the lines of people waiting to take photos with costumed characters, their laughter and chatter grating against the silence in his own mind. His steps slowed as he approached the Walk of Fame. The stars embedded in the pavement sparkled faintly beneath his feet, their names a testament to lives lived in the spotlight. Enrique stopped in front of one star, crouching down to trace the letters with his finger. It belonged to an actor he had once worked with, someone whose career had continued to soar long after Enrique's had fizzled out. As he knelt there, memories flooded back, memories of bright lights and adoring fans, of standing on this very street and signing autographs until his hand ached. He had been so sure of himself back then, so certain that the fame and fortune would last forever, but nothing had. Rising to his feet, Enrique glanced around at the bustling crowds. The faces of the tourists blurred together, their voices melding into a cacophony of sound. He felt like an intruder, as though he no longer belonged to this world of bright lights and endless possibility. That he wandered aimlessly for hours, his thoughts heavy and fragmented. As the afternoon wore on, the streets began to empty, the holiday crowds retreating indoors to escape the cold. Enrique found himself on a quiet side street, far from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. It was here that he spotted a small cafe, its windows fogged with condensation. The warm glow of its interior beckoned to him, and before he could second-guess himself, Enrique pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell of coffee and fresh pastries enveloped him, and for a moment, he felt a pang of nostalgia. He ordered the cheapest item on the menu, a plain black coffee, and settled into a corner booth near the window. As he sipped the bitter liquid, Enrique pulled the paper star from his pocket and set it on the table in front of him. Its golden surface seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the cafe, drawing the attention of a young waitress as she passed by. "That's pretty," she said, pausing to glance at the star. "Where did you get it?" "A girl was selling them on the street last night," Enrique replied, his voice low. "She said they bring good luck." The waitress smiled. "Maybe it's true. Sometimes it's the smallest things that can make a big difference." She moved on, leaving Enrique alone with his thoughts. He stared at the star, turning it over in his hands. The words written on it felt heavier now, their message sinking deeper into his mind. Enrique didn't believe in luck, but he did believe in moments, tiny, fleeting moments that had the power to change everything. And as he sat there, surrounded by the hum of the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that this star, this small, fragile thing, might be the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. When he finally left the cafe, the sun was setting, casting the city in hues of orange and gold. Enrique walked back toward the motel, the star safely tucked away in his pocket. The streets were quieter now, the holiday lights beginning to flicker on one by one. As he passed by a row of decorated trees, he paused, his gaze lingering on the twinkling lights. For the first time in a long while, Enrique allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was something, a faint glimmer of hope breaking through the darkness. And in that moment, Enrique realized that maybe, just maybe, the girl's words were right. The motel room was dark, lit only by the soft, blinking red numbers of the bedside alarm clock. Enrique sat on the edge of the bed, the paper star in his hands. He had taken it out again, unable to stop himself from turning it over and over in his fingers. The message written on its surface, "Never lose hope for a true Christmas," felt like a whisper in the back of his mind, a gentle nudge towards something he couldn't quite define. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. Enrique's thoughts were loud, though, a storm of memories and regrets that refused to quiet down. The Walk of Fame, the tourists, the golden glow of the cafe, these images swirled together, mixing with the ghostly echoes of his past life and the stillness. He suddenly felt the crushing weight of his solitude. He hadn't spoken to anyone beyond casual exchanges in weeks, maybe months. The few friends he'd had in his glory days had vanished along with his fortune. Agents, directors, producers, all the people who had once been fixtures in his life, were now unreachable shadows. Enrique lay back on the bed, the star resting on his chest. He stared at the cracked ceiling, his mind drifting. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think about what it would take to start over. Was it even possible? Could he claw his way out of this hole, or was it too late? The shrill ring of the motel phone shattered the silence. Enrique jolted upright, his heart pounding. It took a moment for him to register the sound, his mind struggling to process who could possibly be calling him. He reached for the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" His voice was hoarse, uncertain. Enrique Foster, a deep voice on the other end said, firm but warm. "It's been a while." Enrique froze, the voice tugging at a buried thread in his memory. After a moment, recognition dawned. "Richard?" he asked, disbelief coloring his tone. "The one and only," Richard replied with a faint chuckle. "I wasn't sure this number would work. I had to dig around to find it." Richard Belmont. Enrique hadn't heard that name in years. He had been one of the first producers to take a chance on Enrique, casting him in a small but pivotal role that had helped launch his career. Richard had always been a man of integrity, someone who genuinely cared about his actors, even as the industry grew colder and more cutthroat. What do you want?" Enrique asked, his guard going up instinctively, straight to the point. "I can appreciate that," Richard said. "I'll get right to it, then. I'm putting together a production for Christmas, a benefit show to raise money for a local charity. It's a small project, nothing flashy, but it's important. And I want you to be part of it." Enrique blinked, struggling to process the offer. "You want me to act?" he asked incredulously. "Yes," Richard said. "We're doing an original piece, a simple, heartfelt story about redemption and second chances. I think you'd be perfect for the lead role." Enrique laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Richard, I don't think you understand where I am right now. I'm not exactly in a position to be starring in anything." "I know exactly where you are," Richard said, his tone softening. "And I know what you've been through. But I also know you, Enrique. You were born to perform. That spark doesn't just go away, no matter how much life tries to snuff it out." Enrique fell silent, the weight of Richard's words settling over him. "What's the catch?" he asked finally. "You're not calling me out of the goodness of your heart. What's in it for you?" Richard sighed, a sound that carried both patience and weariness. "The only thing in it for me is knowing I'm doing something that matters," he said. "This isn't about money or prestige. It's about giving people hope, both on stage and off. And if I'm being honest, I think you could use a little hope right now." Enrique leaned back against the headboard, his grip tightening on the phone. "I don't know," he muttered. "It's been so long. I'm not the same person I used to be. I don't even know if I can do it anymore." "You can," Richard said firmly. "And you don't have to do it alone. We'll rehearse, we'll work through it together. Just say yes, Enrique. Give yourself a chance." Enrique closed his eyes, his mind racing. The idea of stepping back onto a stage, of opening himself up to the vulnerability of performing again, was terrifying. But as he sat there, the weight of the star in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, its message echoing in his mind, "Never lose hope." All right, he said finally, the words barely audible. Is that a yes? Richard asked, a note of cautious optimism in his voice. Yes, Enrique said more firmly. I'll do it. Good, Richard said, relief evident in his tone. Rehearsals start next week. I'll text you the details. And Enrique, thank you. I know this isn't easy, but I think you'll be glad you said yes. Enrique hung up the phone and sat there for a long time, staring at the receiver in his hand. The room felt different now, as though a small shift had occurred, altering the air itself. For the first time in years, Enrique felt the faint stirrings of purpose. It wasn't much, and it wasn't certain, but it was a beginning. As he lay back down, the star glimmered faintly on the nightstand, its golden surface catching the dim light. Enrique stared at it, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe, he whispered to himself, just maybe. Enrique sat in the small lobby of the community theater, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above him. The chipped wooden chair beneath him creaked every time he shifted his weight, and the air carried the faint scent of paint and sawdust. The space was a far cry from the grand theaters and sound stages he had known in his prime. Back then, he had been surrounded by luxurious velvet seats and gilded balconies. Now, he was in a modest building that could barely accommodate 100 people. A wave of doubt rolled over him. What was he doing here? His pride screamed at him to leave, to walk out the door before anyone else saw him. This wasn't where a star belonged, not even a faded one like himself, but he stayed. The paper star rested in the pocket of his coat, its comforting weight anchoring him in place. He had been carrying it with him everywhere since that night, as though it were a talisman. Enrique clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. A door opened, and Richard Belmont stepped into the lobby, his broad smile instantly lighting up the room. Time had etched fine lines into Richard's face, but his presence remained as commanding as ever. He walked toward Enrique with an outstretched hand. Enrique, Richard said warmly. I'm glad you came. Enrique stood and shook his hand, managing a weak smile. I wasn't sure I would, Enrique admitted. Richard chuckled, his grip firm but reassuring. But you're here, and that's what matters. Come on, let me show you the stage. Enrique followed Richard through the narrow hallway, past a bulletin board plastered with flyers for local events and performances. They entered the theater's main space, a small, unassuming room with a simple stage at one end and rows of mismatched chairs facing it. The stage was bare, save for a few pieces of unfinished set design scattered across it. It's not much, I know, Richard said, his voice softening as he noticed Enrique's expression. But it has heart. And right now, that's exactly what we need. Enrique nodded, though his stomach churned with apprehension. Richard gestured toward the stage. Go ahead. Step up there. Enrique hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground. The idea of standing on a stage again, exposing himself, becoming vulnerable, felt almost insurmountable. But Richard's steady gaze gave him the push he needed. Slowly, Enrique climbed the short steps and walked to the center of the stage. The view from up there was strange. The rows of empty chairs stared back at him like silent witnesses, their presence both comforting and intimidating. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. You remember what it feels like, don't you? Richard called from the audience. Enrique's lips twitched into a faint smile. It's been a long time. Richard nodded. It'll come back to you. Trust me. Now, come on down. I want you to meet the rest of the cast. They moved backstage, where a small group of actors was gathered. Most were young, their faces alight with the kind of enthusiasm Enrique hadn't felt in years. A few older performers mingled among them, their expressions warm and welcoming. This is our lead, Enrique Foster, Richard announced, his tone filled with pride. Some of you may recognize him. The group greeted him with polite smiles and nods, but Enrique could feel their curiosity, and perhaps skepticism, lingering in the air. He wondered how many of them had Googled his name the moment they'd heard he was joining the production. They would have found plenty, the glittering headlines of his success, followed by the harsh tabloid stories of his downfall. A young woman with bright red hair stepped forward and extended her hand. "Hi, I'm Clara," she said. "I'm playing your daughter in the show." Enrique shook her hand, trying to suppress the pang of nerves that flared in his chest. "It's nice to meet you," he said, his voice steady despite the unease bubbling beneath the surface. The introductions continued, each cast member sharing their role and offering a brief word of encouragement. Despite their warm words, Enrique couldn't shake the feeling that he was an outsider among them. Rehearsals began the next day, and Enrique quickly realized just how rusty he had become. His voice felt strained during the vocal exercises, and his movements on stage were stiff and awkward. He stumbled over his lines, his mind struggling to keep pace with the script. The younger actors picked up their cues with ease, their energy filling the room. Enrique, meanwhile, felt like he was wading through quicksand. Every mistake felt magnified, every misstep a glaring reminder of how far he had fallen. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult rehearsal, Enrique snapped. "Why am I even here?" he blurted out, his voice echoing through the empty theater. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Enrique's face burned with shame, but he couldn't stop the words from spilling out. "I'm not cut out for this anymore," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't belong here." Richard stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. "You're here because you said yes," Richard said. "Because somewhere inside you, you know this is where you're meant to be. And yes, it's hard. Starting over always is. But don't let your pride rob you of this chance, Enrique." Enrique looked away, his jaw tight. Clara approached him, her voice gentle but resolute. "We've all had rough starts. But that's what rehearsals are for, to get better. To find our way. You don't have to be perfect right now. Just don't give up." Her words, coupled with Richard's steady presence, struck a chord in Enrique. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to push past the shame. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's try again." From that day on, Enrique threw himself into the work with renewed determination. It wasn't easy, his body ached from the long hours, and his mind often felt stretched to its limits. But bit by bit, he began to find his rhythm. The first time he delivered a line without stumbling, the cast broke into applause. Enrique felt a flicker of pride, a faint reminder of the joy he had once felt on stage. By the end of the week, he no longer felt like an outsider. The cast had become a team, their shared struggles and triumphs binding them together. And though Enrique still carried the weight of his past, he also carried something new, a sense of possibility. One night, as he walked back to the motel, Enrique pulled the paper star from his pocket and held it up to the light of a street lamp. The words glimmered faintly, their message as clear as ever. For the first time, Enrique felt like he was beginning to believe them. The days bled into each other as rehearsals intensified, filling Enrique's hours with a relentless rhythm. Each morning, he made his way to the small community theater, the paper star tucked securely in his pocket. The room that had once felt foreign was becoming familiar, the once overwhelming stage slowly turning into a space where he could begin to breathe again. The production, titled The Christmas Redemption, told the story of a man much like Enrique himself, a person burdened by his past who finds renewal through unexpected connections. Playing the role was an eerie mirror of his own life, and at times, the lines he delivered felt less like fiction and more like confessions. At first, Enrique struggled to keep up with the younger cast members. Their energy seemed boundless, their enthusiasm contagious, and their ability to snap into character effortless. Enrique envied their freedom, free from baggage, free from failure, free from the weight of a name that had once been synonymous with success. He worked tirelessly to reclaim his footing, pushing his body and voice further than he had in years. The simplest tasks, projecting his voice, hitting his marks, embodying his character, became Herculean efforts. Some days, it felt impossible. One rehearsal, midway through a critical scene, Enrique froze. The moment was meant to be one of raw vulnerability. His character, a broken man, was supposed to confront the pain of losing his family. The director, a stern but kind woman named Janet, had reminded him to dig deep, to let the emotions spill out naturally. But as Enrique stood on stage, the words caught in his throat. His co-star Clara, playing his estranged daughter, waited patiently for him to deliver his line. The room grew uncomfortably silent, the air heavy with tension. "Take your time," Janet said gently, but Enrique couldn't move. The emotions he was supposed to channel felt too real, too close to the surface. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. Finally, he shook his head and muttered, "I can't." He stepped off the stage and walked quickly toward the exit, leaving the cast in stunned silence. In the alley behind the theater, Enrique leaned against the cold brick wall, his breath coming in short gasps. He hated this feeling, the rawness, the exposure, the way his failures seemed to bleed into every corner of his life. The door creaked open behind him, and Clara stepped out. She approached cautiously, her footsteps soft against the pavement. "Enrique," she began, her voice tentative, "are you okay?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Do I look okay?" Clara leaned against the wall beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She didn't push him to talk, didn't demand explanations. Instead, she simply waited. After a long silence, Enrique spoke. It's been so long since I let myself feel anything," he admitted. "I've spent years numbing myself, running from everything I didn't want to face. And now, standing up there, it's like all of it is flooding back at once. I don't know how to handle it." Clara nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "That's the thing about acting, though, isn't it? It forces you to confront the things you've been avoiding. It's scary as hell, but it's also healing." Enrique turned to her, surprised by the wisdom in her words. "Do you think I can do this?" he asked quietly, his vulnerability stark and unguarded. Clara smiled, a warm and genuine expression. "I know you can. And you're not alone. We're all here to help you." Her words lingered in Enrique's mind as they returned to the theater. The cast greeted him with understanding smiles, and Janet simply nodded, as if to say, "I knew you'd come back." The rest of the rehearsal was challenging, but Enrique found himself leaning into the discomfort rather than shying away from it. He stumbled over his lines, struggled to maintain his composure, but with each attempt, he felt a little more connected to the role, and to himself. As the weeks went on, the cast began to gel in a way that only shared struggle can create. The theater became a second home, its walls filled with laughter, frustration, and the occasional burst of applause. Enrique found himself looking forward to rehearsals, even on the days when they left him physically and emotionally drained. There were moments of triumph, too. One afternoon, Enrique nailed a particularly difficult scene, his voice ringing out across the theater with a raw intensity that left the room silent. When he finished, the cast erupted into applause, their cheers echoing off the walls. For the first time in years, Enrique felt a flicker of pride, not the shallow, fleeting pride of fame, but the deep, satisfying pride of earning something through hard work and perseverance. Still, there were setbacks. Enrique often wrestled with his own self-doubt, his mind filled with whispers of inadequacy. Every stumble, every missed cue felt like proof that he didn't belong. One evening, as the cast gathered around for a break, Enrique found himself sitting alone in the corner, the paper star resting in his palm. He traced the words with his finger, the message grounding him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Clara noticed him and sat down beside him. "That star means a lot to you, doesn't it?" she asked. Enrique nodded, his gaze fixed on the glittering surface. "It reminds me that there's still hope, even when everything feels hopeless." Clara smiled. "Sounds like exactly what you need right now." As the final weeks of rehearsal approached, Enrique began to see the transformation in himself. His movements on stage grew more fluid, his voice more confident. The scenes that had once felt insurmountable now carried an emotional weight that felt authentic and earned. But more importantly, Enrique began to feel something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. The cast had become a family, their shared journey creating bonds that transcended the stage. And while Enrique still carried the weight of his past, he also carried the hope of something new, a chance to rebuild, to reconnect, to rediscover the joy he had once known. One night, as the cast prepared to leave, Janet gathered them together. "I want to thank all of you for your hard work," she said, her voice filled with emotion. This show is about redemption, about finding light in the darkness. And every one of you has brought that message to life. I couldn't be prouder." As the group dispersed, Enrique lingered on the stage, gazing out at the empty seats. For the first time, he didn't see them as a reminder of what he had lost. Instead, he saw them as a promise of what was to come, and as he stood there, the paper star warm in his pocket, Enrique allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way back to the light. The final days of rehearsal came and went in a whirlwind of activity, leaving Enrique both exhausted and exhilarated. The set pieces were finally complete, the costumes had been fitted, and the lighting cues meticulously adjusted. The small theater, which once seemed so plain and unremarkable, had been transformed into a warm and magical space. The night before the performance, the cast and crew gathered for one last rehearsal, a full dress run. It was their chance to iron out any final details, to ensure everything would flow smoothly when the curtain rose. The air was thick with anticipation and a touch of nervous energy. Enrique stood backstage, adjusting his costume in front of a cracked mirror. The outfit was simple but perfectly suited to his character, a worn blazer, a slightly tattered scarf, and scuffed shoes. The man staring back at him in the mirror looked every bit the part of a soul searching for redemption, but there was something else in his reflection, something Enrique hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just the character he was playing, it was himself. The spark that had once defined him, that had drawn audiences to his performances, was beginning to return. Clara appeared behind him, her costume a stark contrast to his, a bright, hopeful ensemble that reflected her role as his character's estranged daughter. She smiled, her expression a mix of encouragement and excitement. "You ready for this?" she asked. Enrique adjusted his scarf and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The final rehearsal was both grueling and exhilarating. Every movement, every line, every note of the accompanying music had to be perfect. Janet, the director, sat in the audience with a notebook, scribbling down last-minute adjustments. When the rehearsal ended, the cast gathered on the stage, their faces flushed with effort and adrenaline. Janet stood and clapped, her applause echoing through the empty theater. "That," she said, her voice filled with pride, "was beautiful. Tomorrow night, you're going to change lives, yours included." The words lingered in the air as the cast slowly dispersed, gathering their belongings and preparing to leave. Enrique lingered on the stage, gazing out at the rows of empty chairs. Tomorrow, those seats would be filled with an audience. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. As the others filed out of the theater, Clara approached Enrique, holding a paper bag in her hands. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "A little pre-show tradition. Open it when you get home." Enrique raised an eyebrow but accepted the bag. "What is it?" "You'll see," Clara said with a wink before disappearing out the door. The walk back to the motel was quiet, the crisp December air biting at Enrique's face. The city felt strangely still, as though it were holding its breath in anticipation of the holiday ahead. Enrique pulled his coat tighter around him, the paper star nestled safely in his pocket. When he reached his room, he placed the bag on the nightstand and sat down on the bed. He opened it carefully, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a star, handcrafted, like the one he had bought from the girl on the street. This one was different, though. Its paper was silver, and its edges were adorned with tiny sequins that sparkled faintly under the dim light of the motel lamp. Beneath the star was a folded note. Enrique unfolded it and read the neatly written words. "Every star needs a little help to shine again. You've got this. Break a leg." Enrique felt a lump rise in his throat. The gesture was small, but it carried a weight that hit him deeply. He placed the silver star beside the golden one on the nightstand, their shimmering surfaces reflecting the faint glow of the lamp. For the first time in what felt like forever, Enrique allowed himself to hope, not just for the performance, but for everything that lay beyond it. The next morning, the theater buzzed with activity as the cast and crew prepared for the evening's show. Costumes were adjusted, props were placed, and the lighting team worked tirelessly to ensure every cue would be perfect. Enrique arrived early, the stars tucked safely in his coat pocket. He wandered through the backstage area, taking in the energy around him. The camaraderie among the cast was infectious, and Enrique found himself smiling as he joined in their chatter. As the hours ticked by, the weight of the upcoming performance settled over the group. Enrique could see it in their faces, the mix of excitement and nerves that came with knowing they were about to bare their souls on stage. When the call came for the cast to take their places, Enrique felt his heart pounding in his chest. He stood in the wings, listening to the murmurs of the audience as they filed into their seats. The sound was both familiar and foreign, a reminder of a world he had once known intimately. As the house lights dimmed and the first notes of the overture played, Enrique took a deep breath. "You've got this," he whispered to himself, the weight of the stars in his pocket grounding him. The curtain rose, and the magic began. The first act passed in a blur, the scenes unfolding with a precision that came from weeks of hard work. Enrique's lines flowed effortlessly, his movements on stage natural and assured. The audience responded with gasps, laughter, and the occasional murmur of approval. During the intermission, Enrique stood backstage, his adrenaline still high. Clara approached him, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You're killing it out there," she said. Enrique smiled, his confidence growing. "Feels good to be back." The second act brought the emotional core of the story to life. Enrique's character, burdened by regret, finally found the courage to confront his pain and reconnect with his daughter. The scene was raw, powerful, and utterly transformative. As the final lines of the play were spoken, the stage lights dimmed, and the audience erupted into applause. Enrique stood in the center of the stage, his heart pounding as he bowed alongside the cast. The sound of the audience's cheers washed over him, filling the emptiness he had carried for so long. Backstage, the cast hugged and congratulated one another, their faces glowing with pride. Enrique felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging, of purpose. As he gathered his things to leave, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd, a small girl with dark hair and watchful eyes. She held a box of stars in her hands, the same box she had carried the night he had met her. Their eyes met, and she smiled, a quiet, knowing expression that seemed to say, "I told you so." Enrique nodded in return, the weight of his journey suddenly feeling lighter. And as he stepped out into the crisp night air, the stars in his pocket and the applause still echoing in his ears, Enrique felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The night had arrived. The theater hummed with energy, the kind of charged anticipation that only comes before a live performance. Outside, a line of people stretched down the block, their breath visible in the crisp December air. Laughter and conversation filled the space as families, couples, and groups of friends eagerly waited to take their seats. Enrique stood in the wings, peeking out from behind the curtain as the audience filtered in. The seats filled quickly, their voices blending into a harmonious buzz of excitement. The small theater was completely packed, its modest rows alive with movement. The house lights cast a warm glow over the crowd, illuminating their eager faces. He turned away from the scene, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. The rest of the cast bustled around him, adjusting costumes, running lines, and sharing whispered words of encouragement. Clara appeared at his side, her costume as vibrant as her expression. "Big night," she said, nudging him lightly. "You ready?" Enrique gave her a small smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." She studied him for a moment before reaching into her pocket. "Here," she said, handing him a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" Enrique asked, unfolding it carefully. "It's a little something we all wrote for you," she said. "A reminder that we've got your back." The note was filled with short, handwritten messages from the cast and crew. "You're going to kill it tonight. Thank you for inspiring us. We're so proud of you, Enrique." Enrique felt his chest tighten, a warmth spreading through him that he hadn't experienced in years. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, right next to the paper star. "Thank you," he said softly. Clara smiled and gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before disappearing into the flurry of activity backstage. The call came for the cast to take their places. Enrique moved to his mark, the stage dim and quiet as the final audience members settled into their seats. He stood in the shadows, his heart pounding as the anticipation built. The house lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the theater. The overture began, its soft, melodic notes filling the space. Enrique closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. When the curtain rose, he stepped into the light, and the world faded away. The first act unfolded seamlessly. Enrique moved through his scenes with a confidence that surprised even him. The lines, the movements, the emotions, they all felt natural, as though they had always been a part of him. The audience responded to every moment, their laughter and gasps a tangible presence in the room. Enrique could feel their energy, their engagement, and it fueled his performance. By the time the first act ended, Enrique was drenched in sweat, his pulse racing. Backstage, the cast exchanged hurried congratulations, their excitement palpable. Clara approached him with a wide grin. "You're crushing it out there," she said, her enthusiasm infectious. Enrique chuckled, his confidence growing with every passing moment. "It's not just me. We're all doing this together." The second act began, and with it came the heart of the story. Enrique's character, weighed down by guilt and regret, reached his emotional breaking point. The pivotal scene arrived, a confrontation between Enrique's character and Clara's, his estranged daughter. Standing on the dimly lit stage, Enrique could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The air was thick with tension, the audience silent and expectant. "You don't understand what it's like," Enrique's character said, his voice raw with emotion. "To lose everything. To fail the people you love." Clara's character stepped forward, her expression a mixture of anger and pain. "And you don't understand what it's like to watch someone you love destroy themselves. You think you're the only one who's hurting. We all hurt. We all fall. But you gave up." The words hit Enrique like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was responding as the character or as himself. "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to stop." The silence that followed was heavy, the audience holding its collective breath. Enrique felt tears prick his eyes, and he let them fall, unguarded and honest. Clara reached out, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "It's not too late," she said softly. "It's never too late." The line, simple and sincere, resonated deeply with Enrique. He could feel the audience's presence, their connection to the moment, and it was unlike anything he had experienced before. When the scene ended, the applause was immediate and thunderous. Enrique stood there, his chest heaving. As the lights faded to black, the final scenes brought the story to its resolution, a hopeful and redemptive ending that left the audience cheering. When the curtain fell for the last time, the cast took their bows, the applause washing over them like a wave. Enrique stood at the center, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. For the first time in years, he felt whole. As the cast filed backstage, the theater buzzed with excitement. Friends and family of the cast members gathered in the lobby, their voices filling the space with joy. Enrique lingered at the edge of the crowd, watching as Clara greeted her parents and other cast members embraced their loved ones. He felt a pang of longing but quickly pushed it aside. Tonight wasn't about what he didn't have, it was about what he had found. From the corner of his eye, he saw her, a small girl with dark hair in a familiar cardboard box. She stood near the entrance, her eyes wide as she took in the crowd. Enrique approached her slowly, unsure if she would recognize him. "You were amazing," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise. Enrique knelt to her level, a smile spreading across his face. "Thank you," he said. "And thank you for this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the golden star she had sold him weeks ago. The girl's face lit up with recognition. "You kept it," she said, her tone filled with quiet wonder. "Of course," Enrique said. "It reminded me not to lose hope." The girl beamed, her smile brighter than any of the lights in the theater. Enrique reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded bill. "For your stars," he said, handing it to her. She shook her head. "You don't have to. I want to," Enrique interrupted gently. "You've given me more than you know." The girl hesitated before taking the money, her gratitude shining in her eyes. As she disappeared into the crowd, Enrique stood there for a moment, the noise of the theater fading into the background. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The applause from the performance lingered in Enrique's mind as he walked back to the small motel he still called home. The city was quieter now, its holiday lights glowing faintly against the cold night. In his pocket, he felt the gentle weight of the two stars, the golden one from the girl and the silver one gifted by Clara. He ran his fingers over them absent-mindedly, their presence grounding him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The street seemed different tonight, less daunting, as though they had softened under the warm glow of his accomplishment. Enrique felt a quiet pride that he hadn't known in years. Not the hollow pride of fame or wealth, but something deeper, pride in having overcome, in having found his place again, even if just for one night. Back in his motel room, Enrique sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the stars as he placed them side by side on the nightstand. His mind drifted back to the girl in the audience, her smile a reminder of the night they had first met. She had changed everything, her small act of kindness a spark that had reignited something he thought was long extinguished. Enrique leaned back against the wall, exhaustion finally settling over him. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't consumed by regret or anger. Instead, they were filled with the faces of the cast, the sounds of the audience's applause, and the promise of something more. The next morning, the city was already buzzing with holiday energy. Enrique woke early, his body sore but his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He dressed quickly, slipping the golden star into his pocket before heading out. The air was crisp as he walked through the streets, the faint smell of pine and roasted chestnuts lingering in the air. Enrique had no particular destination in mind, he simply let his feet guide him. He passed a toy store where children pressed their faces against the glass, marveling at the elaborate displays. Nearby, a man dressed as Santa Claus rang a bell, collecting donations for a charity. Enrique paused, watching as people dropped coins and bills into the collection bucket. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. It wasn't much, but it was what he could spare. He approached the man and dropped the money into the bucket. "Thank you, sir," the man said warmly. Enrique nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. As the day wore on, Enrique found himself drawn back to the theater. The building was quiet now, the echoes of the previous night's performance still lingering in its walls. The stage, which had felt so intimidating weeks ago, now felt like a second home. Janet, the director, was there, packing up her notes and supplies. She looked up as Enrique entered and smiled. "Enrique," she said, her tone bright. "What brings you here?" "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "For giving me this chance. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Janet walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You earned it," she said. "And you've given us something extraordinary in return. I hope you know that." Enrique nodded, emotion welling up in his chest. Before he left, Janet handed him a folded piece of paper. "The charity we raised money for last night," she explained. "They're always looking for volunteers. I thought you might be interested." Enrique took the paper, glancing at the name of the organization. It was a local group dedicated to helping at-risk youth, kids who reminded him of the girl with the stars. "Thank you," he said again, slipping the paper into his pocket. Later that evening, Enrique found himself standing outside the charity's headquarters. It was a modest building, its exterior decorated with twinkling lights and a simple wreath on the door. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the space enveloped him immediately, a stark contrast to the chill outside. A group of children sat in a corner, folding paper stars under the guidance of a volunteer. Enrique smiled, his thoughts drifting back to the girl on the street corner. He approached the volunteer, who greeted him with a friendly smile. "Hi," Enrique said. "I heard you might be looking for volunteers." The woman's face lit up. "We're always looking for extra hands," she said. "Do you have experience working with kids?" Enrique thought about his years as a child actor, the way adults had shaped his life, for better or worse. He nodded. "You could say that." She handed him a star, its edges still raw from being folded. "Start here," she said. Enrique sat down with the children, his hand surprisingly steady as he folded the paper into a star. The kids watched him curiously, their faces filled with a mix of awe and amusement. "Have you done this before?" one of them asked. "Not exactly," Enrique admitted. "But I had a pretty good teacher." Days turned into weeks, and Enrique's involvement with the charity deepened. He volunteered regularly, working with the kids on everything from crafts to small performances. The work was fulfilling in a way he hadn't expected, a reminder that his talent could be used for more than just applause. The girl who had sold him the star appeared one afternoon, her shy smile lighting up the room as she joined the group. Enrique greeted her warmly, his heart swelling with gratitude for the role she had played in his journey. "You're back," he said. She nodded. "I wanted to help." Enrique placed a hand on her shoulder. "You already have." As the new year approached, Enrique reflected on how much had changed. He wasn't rich or famous, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had rediscovered his passion for storytelling, found a community that valued him, and begun to rebuild his life from the ground up. On New Year's Eve, he stood outside the theater, watching as the city came alive with celebrations. The paper stars rested in his pocket, their messages a constant reminder of how far he had come. As fireworks lit up the night sky, Enrique made a silent promise to himself. He would face the new year with hope, determination, and gratitude, for the second chance he had been given, and for the people who had helped him find it. And as the clock struck midnight, Enrique smiled, the light of the stars within him shining brighter than ever. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.